And I waited and I waited and I waited to see. Hey everyone, hi, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm so glad to bring you 10 picture books. These are the 10 picture books that were chosen as Best Illustrated, chosen by the New York Times and the New York Public Library. It's an actual whole thing out there. The 2024 list was recently announced, and I hope to bring you that as well. But this is 2023's list. If you are new to my channel, then know that I'm Shelly, and this is a regular feature on my channel in which I talk about picture books and my love for picture books and gawk over the beautiful art in these children's books. So if you're new and you're not subscribed, I would encourage you to subscribe, stick around, and let's go ahead and get into the meat of this video. The first book is Mary's Idea, written and illustrated by Chris Rashka. Now, I love the choice of this beautiful, bold color of the cover. However, it really doesn't reflect what's inside the book. Inside of the book is a very narrow color palette. Most of the pages only have black, white, and brown, and most of the pages are only a pair of hands. This tells the story about a little girl named Mary who at the age of 3 decided that she wanted to play the piano and to write music. And at one point she stopped playing the piano and writing music and took a rest and then ended up coming back to it. The Mary that they're referring to is actually Mary Lou Williams, who is one of, at least according to the back of this book, one of America's greatest musicians. She was a child prodigy, a composer, an arranger, a band leader, a teacher, a concert pianist, and she played a variety of different kinds of music. However, I didn't get that from the pages of the book. It is only until you read the back of the book or read that little biography about Mary Lou Williams do you realize who this Mary is referring to. In essence, the focus of the book is a Mary who, again, maintains her autonomy over her musical life. And in some ways, I felt like that was a bit of a misstep. The simplicity could have been bolstered up ever so slightly to give the reader a little bit more context of who this is. But overall, it wasn't a bad book. It worked in its own very simple and sweet way. Continuing with the musical theme, we have Rock Rosetta Rock, Roll Rosetta Roll, presenting Sister Rosetta Tharpe, the grandmother of rock and roll. This is written by Tanya Bolden and illustrated by R. Gregory Christie. This is going to be talking about someone, well, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who was a musician and played rock music, as the title would suggest, before Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, and Johnny Cash. So this little girl, you get actually more of a narrative biography than you do with Mary's Idea. And in this, we find out that Rosetta had shown quite a bit of musical talent from when she was a very little girl and born in a very tiny little town. Now, at some point, Rosetta's mother decides that she wants to be a preacher, and so they move to a bigger city. And so while her mother is preaching, Rosetta is showing off her quite immense and beautiful musical talent to those who were listening to her mother's preaching. And so there's this little girl with a big old guitar, and then you see this little girl with a big old voice, and she really gets the roots of her musical making abilities in the church. That is her first crowd, that is her first audience. And from there we see how Rosetta's career starts to unfold and to grow. Eventually she makes it onto the radio, and you know, at the end of the pages we see Rosetta as an older woman still making music and still doing her thing, which is really cool. I quite liked getting this type of biography about a musical figure. Also, the back of the book has a note about who Sister Rosetta Tharpe is, and on a separate 2 pages, there is a whole timeline of Rosetta's life, which is really great, especially since the story is so engaging that it made me want to learn more about who this musical figure was. Next up is Before Now by Daniel Salmieri. Now this book starts out quite large, literally. We get a page of the world from afar, like our globe, our earth from afar. Then it zooms into a particular place. Then it zooms into a particular city, and then a particular apartment where a little girl is being fed a bowl of oatmeal. From there, we see this little girl grow up, develop into a toddler, and then a child, and then a teenager who is interested in science. This teenager does teenagery things like going to concerts, and eventually she studies and becomes a scientist. From there, we see that this person that we've been following her entire life ends up having her own child, and that child grows, and then that child has her own child, and we see our main character who we met at the beginning of her life holding her grandchild at the beginning of their life. So it was almost like the whole life cycle in a book. Art-wise, this is the one that I think I connected with the least, even though I quite liked the whole life cycle of a human and following somebody through their entire life till its very end. I quite liked that part of it, but for whatever reason, the illustrations for me were a little bit lacking. Next up on the list is actually going to be one of the most mesmerizing books, and actually it has mesmerizing in the subtitle, but it's We Are Starlings, inside the mesmerizing magic of a murmuration. This is written by Robert Farrow and Donna Jo Napoli, and it's illustrated by Mark Martin. Now, this book in general is told from the perspective of the starlings. No, not in general. This book is told from the perspective of the starlings. We are starlings. This morning is chilly. We are restless to leave this cold place. We take to the air and meet up with more starlings. And so it tells the story about how the starlings function as an entire body in the sky. There are hundreds and even thousands of starlings that somehow work together as a whole. And it's really brought home through that voice of we, and it's told in that voice the entire time. Now, what Mark Martin does that is so brilliant is that he leaves a little texture to the art medium on the page. So a lot of times you see the bleeding of the paint on the page, and that is what's making the feather texture for the birds, which I really love. I also found it really impressive and almost, again, mesmerizing when we get the starlings, and somehow Mark Martin is able to fit more and more and more starlings on the page. At the very end, there's a bit more about starlings and how they fly, and a little more information about these birds and where they come from, which I thought was great because this book is doing exactly what the Rosetta Tharpe book is doing, in that it is making the reader interested in these birds because they're highlighting the unique things about the birds. And then at the very end, you do have this opportunity to read further about these birds. I didn't realize this until this very second, but Donna Jo Napoli helped write the Starling book, but she also wrote As Night Falls, Creatures That Go Wild After Dark. So she's the writer of another book that's been highlighted on this list. That's fascinating. So this is illustrated by Felita Sala. Now this starts off surprisingly as a bedtime story. We see this family, they're winding down to go to bed, and then the story changes. Basically, what the author does, what is her name? Napoli. What Napoli does is that she focuses in on this microscopic little creature that is alive and, squirming about in the night. And so it's the tiny Drago flagets. Oh my gracious. And then basically this nighttime story turns into something kind of vicious, but because we see this little organism being eaten by shrimpy copepods, and then the shrimps get eaten by goby fish. And the goby fish are eaten by spiders. The spiders are eaten by bats. The bats are eaten by snakes. And then all of a sudden, the weasels and jackals arrive to snack on the snakes. All of this happens, of course, when we are asleep. And then the jackals and weasels are food for owls, and the owls and all the other things, because the owls have all those other things in their tummy, all the way down to the little bacterial type things, and the little shrimpies are eaten by a tiger. And then the tiger has everything in his stomach. And at the very end, it goes back to the family who was winding down for bed, and they end up, going to bed and snuggling up. And it was really more about how these other creatures are alive during the nighttime process while we are going to sleep. The food chain is still happening, essentially. Then at the very end, it talks about the creatures that were featured in this book, which again is doing one of my favorite things, further reading for the interested reader. Next up is How to Write a Poem by Kwame Alexander and Deanna Nikaido, and it's illustrated by Melissa Sweet. Now this has a collage type illustration style, which I quite like, and I think it works really well for this book because it is talking about how to get your mind into writing a poem. So it starts with, begin with a question like an acorn waiting for spring. Close your eyes, open the window of your mind, and climb out like a seedling reaching for tomorrow. And so in a lot of ways, I feel like it's helping young readers and writers think about poetry, like the right mindset for poetry. Or if you wanted to write a poem, which is why it's How to Write a Poem, then it's focusing on the little things, the sensory details, the things that we kind of flippantly walk by every single day. Actually take a moment to really hone in on those things and enjoy those aspects of life. And that's where you can get the inspiration to write your first poem. These next two books, even though they're in the middle tier, they're at the top of that middle tier. So a tier within a tier. And it's called At the Drop of a Cat. And it is written by Elise Fontiele and illustrated by Violeta Lopez. And it is translated from the French by Karen Snelson and Emily Robert Wong. Now, what I like about this is that we meet our little protagonist who is 6 years old and is learning to read and write. And during this time of life of learning the fundamentals of reading and writing, our protagonist is going to his grandfather Louise's house every single day. And Louise lives in what is described as a very tiny house, and around it he's surrounded by a garden. And Louise is a foreigner to the country that this grandchild is from, and so Louise says the wrong things. So he says at the drop of a cat instead of at the drop of a hat. And it's really interesting because it got me thinking about the privileges this young protagonist has, and that this young protagonist is in some ways aware of that the grandfather never did have, which is that the little one is learning how to read and write, and his grandfather was never taught that at a young age. And it's just a really sweet story about the relationship between this young protagonist and his grandfather. And the illustrations are very smart. It really has this green landscape all about it, these green plants. And in some of the pictures, we see the outline of the grandfather, but then what fills in the grandfather is this greenery, which is so brilliantly done. And again, it has the texture on the page that we can see. And then you also see the outline of the little boy. I think it aesthetically just has such a strong and wonderful point of view. And I also really enjoyed the story. It's the story of, valuing our education and appreciating the generations that came before us, connecting with another generation, and being an encourager on whichever side you're on. So the grandfather is very encouraging to the grandchild, and the grandchild is very encouraging to his grandfather, and they have a really healthy healthy and beautiful relationship. Next up is The Young Teacher and the Great Serpent. It's written by Irene Vasco and illustrated by Juan Palmino, and it's translated from the Spanish by Lawrence Schimmel. Now, this is the story about a young teacher who is getting her first teaching assignment, and her very first teaching assignment is away from the city for which she is staying and into a very teeny little village in the Amazon. I really liked the way that this illustrator does landscapes. I really love the 2-page spread of the city and how we have to follow these roads going into somewhere more rural. So the teacher arrives as she's teaching school for one of the first times. She is told that they need to flee the area because a giant serpent is coming and the villagers are frightened of this serpent. She, in her academic wisdom, says there is no serpent large enough to really scare all of us away. Like, we're larger than any serpent, so why are we scared of these old folk tales? She ends up listening to the villagers and abandons her outdoor classroom and climbs up to a hill. And then she realizes what the villagers are speaking about, which is about a river rising, and the river looks like a giant serpent swallowing up all of the area around it. And so she realizes it's not just an old folk tale, but that there is some wisdom to running away from this giant serpent. But in the process, she loses all of her books, and she's really quite distraught over this loss. After the river has settled and all of the destruction has been done, she does indeed lose all of her books. And what the villagers do is they band together and they actually sew her brand new books. They end up rebuilding the classroom, but instead with a more like durable and sustainable textbook, if you will. I got this sense that wisdom can come from anywhere, and I really liked that message. You know, here we have someone who is traditionally educated thinking that she knows something, and she does, but there was still something for her to have learned, and then coming together as a whole and bonding at a time of crisis, which I thought was really wonderful. Top two books. Okay, we have arrived. The first of the two is Bear is Never Alone by Mark Veerkamp, illustrated by Jessica Verstegen, and it's translated by Laura Watkinson, translated from the Dutch by Laura Watkinson. Now, this is the story of Bear, who lives in the forest and is playing the piano, and the piano brings a lot of joy to others, and all of a sudden the other people in the forest or other creatures of the forest start to put a ton of pressure on Bear and badgering Bear to play more piano and to give them more music, and Bear is frustrated, and so he runs away and pushes everyone away, and then he's finally alone, except for he's not alone. There's a lone zebra standing there, and the zebra says, you know, you play such beautiful music, what can I do for you instead? What can I do for you, actually? What can I give you? And the bear says, well, I just want to be alone. So the zebra is about to walk off, and then Bear says, well, actually, we can be alone together. And you see them, what supposedly is probably sitting in silence, just side by side, Bear and zebra. And I quite like this because aesthetically, it is absolutely in line with everything that I love. I love a black and white book with only a pop of red. I really love the aesthetic of this book. We've made it to the top book, and that is Bunny and Tree, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this video, because I saw this book online and I knew I had to see it with my own eyes for myself. And I'm so glad to have this book in my possession and in my collection. It's Bunny and Tree, and it is illustrated by Balint Zenko, who was born in Budapest, immigrated to Canada, and now resides in Los Angeles with his family. So this is a wordless picture book, and it is an adventure story with this little bunny and tree. And there is something about the charm of this book, the absolute charm of this book, the way that the tree protects Bunny, the way that the bunny protects the tree. I just adored this. And again, it has a very distinct artistic point of view, but I think what stood out for me was not only the art, which is it's just beautiful. It's colorful. You can see the texture on the pages. You can see the personality of this bunny and this tree that comes out in this wordless picture book. There is definitely an aesthetic point of view that is being seen here, and it's just charming. But I think the best thing is that it truly is an adventure story that makes sense. There is a sense of peril, there's a sense of bonding, there's a sense of friendship, and there's these two little buds that look out for each other and go on this whole journey together. And I think that this book, of all the books, brought me back to being a kid and why I loved looking at picture books in the first place, and appreciating not only the art but the story that goes along with the art. And this is the blend of both. I just adored it. I'm so glad I have my hands on it. And if you get the opportunity, whether it be from your library or if you end up purchasing this book, spending time, if you get the opportunity to spend time with this book, it is so good. It is so cute and so charming. That's it. Those are all the books. I really appreciate you spending this time with me. And hopefully I'll have 2024's list sooner rather than later. And yeah, that's it for me. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for being here and spending this time with me. And we'll see you all in my next one. Bye.